In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel has a lot of arguments and talking points it uses in the popular media, especially since the devastating October the 7th attacks. This is not surprising because Jews head many of the big American media organisations and pro-Israeli groups spend a lot of money on donations to and lobbying of American politicians. In these slides, I will look at common arguments and points that Israel supporters make and responses and counter-arguments that can be made against them. These are 17 common pro-Israel arguments made in media discussions and debates I'll be looking at. Okay, let's get started. Number 1, denial of Israel's right to exist. Arabs and Palestinians deny Israel's right to exist and will never get a Palestinian state until they recognise Israel. However, Israel and America have for decades denied Palestinians a legal right to exist by opposing Palestinian statehood. America has prevented Palestinians forming a state for generations by opposing its statehood until peace with Israel is reached. And Israel, by occupying many territories in 1967 and afterwards, including East Jerusalem, Gaza until 2005, and the West Bank, have been denying Palestinians the right to exist in their own state. And Israel has further denied Palestinian statehood by, in 2012, opposing and voting against Palestine joining UN with non-member observer status, in 2024, voting against granting Palestine full membership of the UN, and destroying vast amounts of Gaza, which is the last 5% of Greater Palestine that it does not occupy, in its response to the October the 7th terrorist attacks. And by preventing Palestinian statehood, it allows Israelis, Western governments, and the Western media to continue labelling Palestinians as terrorists rather than as combatants from a rival state. And by prohibiting Palestinian statehood, it also makes their bargaining power much weaker. Number 2, Palestine is not a genuine nation. Palestinians are not a genuine people, did not occupy territory, and do not have a claim to a state. There were only 101 nations in the world in 1945 when the UN was created. Since then, more than 90 nations have been established as states, including Arabs and Muslims forming 5 nations in the Middle East since 1945. Middle East boundaries were set by Russia, France and Britain, guided by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It hardly seems fair to deny Palestinian existence because of foreign control of the Levant and Arabia. Palestine is therefore one of many nations to pursue statehood since World War II, just like Israel. And Arabs and Muslims have lived in the Palestinian area for over 1,000 years, and during that time in much, much greater numbers than Jews. It is said that most Palestinians are ancestrally from other nations, but so are most of the Jews in Israel. Number 3, Israel is fighting a war for democracy. Israel is a democracy, the only one in the Middle East, and it should be supported. But are the following democratic practices, stealing, robbing, and settling lands, that is ethnic cleansing, as it is currently doing, the myriad war crimes and crimes against humanity that Israel seems to have committed in Gaza since the 7th of October, such as the following: targeting civilians, depriving citizens of food, water, essential medicine and power supply, using civilians as human shields, wanton destruction of buildings and dwellings, looting, repeated cruelty to detainees and civilians, summary execution and killing of surrendered people, summary execution of hostages, destruction of cemeteries, archives and cultural and historic sites, theft of cultural artefacts, abuse, sexual humiliation and violence against detainees, perfidy, that is, disguised as civilians, excessive civilian deaths, forcible transfer, that is, ethnic cleansing, indiscriminate attacks, creation of buffer zone in eastern Gaza, use of white phosphorus on civilians, and attacks on the following protected targets: aid agencies, hospitals, places of worship, schools and universities, journalists, prepubescent children, shelters and food distribution, refugee camps, apartment buildings, civilian cars and ambulances, water stations, food stores, flower store, solar energy units and electrical generators, agricultural areas, fishermen boats, and in Lebanon, attacks on journalists and civilians, healthcare facilities and religious sites, and use of phosphorus and booby trap devices. And in the West Bank, continued displacement, destruction of dwellings, ethnic cleansing, building new settlements, unlawful attacks and killings. This is a compilation of the different types of alleged Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity following the 7th of October attacks. And this is a compilation of the alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity by Hamas from the 7th of October. Questions to ponder. Why was it the right thing to do to stop Hamas's 7th of October war crimes and crimes against humanity on day one? Yet after more than a year of even more such crimes, America keeps supplying military hardware so that Israel can continue committing them. Doesn't the simple saying, two wrongs do not make a right, apply here? Number 4, the Israel-Hamas war is a war against the West by extremist Islamic forces. However, Israel is not fighting for the West, but rather continuing a 100-year-old conflict between two major religions involving competing land claims. Israel is isolated and has very few international supporters apart from America. There have been many resolutions in the United Nations over the last half-century strongly condemnatory of its many actions. Number 5, Palestinians and Hamas must renounce terrorism. But Jews didn't renounce terrorism to get their state. They committed plenty of terrorism since migration began in earnest after World War I. Terrorism committed by Jewish groups included the following very significant attacks. They include assassinations, bombings, hostage-taking, and murders. This terrorism was successful as Jews were able to declare their statehood on the 14th of May 1948, and Israel has been subsequently recognised by most nation-states. Since Israel was created, it seems like there has been plenty of state terrorism too. Up to 100,000 civilians and combatants have been killed since hostilities erupted between Jews and Palestinians in post-Ottoman Empire Middle East. Most of the victims have been civilians and mostly Palestinians. Thus, their schemes are designed to create terror among Palestinians. If Jews use terrorism to establish the State of Israel, why can't Hamas and Palestinians? It is what black South Africans, Algerians, Irish, and Indians use to varying degrees in pursuing their rights to self-determination. Number 6. If Hamas put down their weapons, there would be peace tomorrow. Yes, this is a good point. But if Israel had withdrawn from Golan Heights, Sinai, East Jerusalem, and West Bank decades ago, Hamas and other extreme groups probably would have done a lot less terrorism, and peace might have been reached decades ago. As Noam Chomsky said, Israel sacrifices security for expansion, or in other words, Israel gets less safety for more land. Number 7. Criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. But one can believe in an Israeli state and its right to exist as a Jewish nation, which makes one a Zionist. So could a Zionist be anti-Semitic if they criticize Israel? Is it not possible to criticize their war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other excesses against Palestinians? Number 8. Palestinian supporters are anti-Semitic because they are not interested in other Muslim suffering. But there are genuine justifications for passionate concern over the Palestinian conflict. It has gone on for over 100 years. It involves 2 key religions of the world. At least tens of thousands have been killed and many more wounded and maimed in the conflict. Many millions of refugees have been created, including many Israeli refugees. Many nations are involved in the conflict since October the 7th, 2023. Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, and America, and even maritime shippers have been drawn into it. It is constantly in the media and in the public space. Hence, it is very difficult to be unaware and not have a view of this conflict. And it involves white settlers in a non-white continent, which is obviously very sensitive in the 21st century. Number 9. Recognition of Palestine as a state is only justified when the conflict is ended. But shouldn't Israel also not be recognised based on that logic? And if Palestine is given formal UN recognition by the Security Council as a full member state, then wouldn't it have a better bargaining position? As has been noted, bargaining as a people without proper legal status gives them weak negotiating power. Number 10. The Hamas attacks of October the 7th must be condemned. Yes, of course, this is absolutely correct. But so should the coalition government parties such as Likud, United Torah Judaism, Shas, Religious Zionist Party, Otzma Yehudit, New Hope and Noam for illegally taking of land and building settlements in the past, present and future. And shouldn't Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity also be condemned? Number 11. Israel has a right to self-defense. Yes, of course. All members of the United Nations have this right. The UN Charter, Article 51, recognises the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations. But this is not a right to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. Hence, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, has been taking appropriate action. And given Israel illegally occupy and thieve land in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, is Hamas acting in self-defense for attacks on military objects inside Israel, including on the 7th of October 2023? Now, this is, of course, not to justify the horrific attacks against civilians on that day. But on the other hand, Palestinians do not have a right to self-defense because they are not a nation state. So Israel is highly motivated to never let them achieve statehood and thus prevent them ever having a right of self-defense. To put it another way, Israel was allocated 55% of Palestine in the UN vote in 1947 without any Arab consent, and in a defensive war it took control of 78% in 1948, and it now occupies approximately 95% of the greater Palestinian area. But somehow Palestine has no right to resist and no right to self-defense. Number 12. There was peace on the 6th of October 2023. But no, there was not. 243 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank in 2023 before the 7th of October attack. This was the deadliest year on record in the West Bank, and since then almost 500 have been killed and 5,000 injured. Even in 2024, there is continued destruction by demolition and arson of Palestinian villages and houses. And Israel has seized more land in the West Bank in 2024 than the previous 20 years combined. That is, ethnic cleansing is ongoing and accelerating. And while Palestinians are still denied full statehood, there cannot be peace. Number 13. Israel gives warnings to civilians to leave areas before it strikes. This is a good thing, but this does not make the subsequent attacks legal if the attacks are on civilian objects, dwellings and infrastructure, occur when many civilians cannot leave for good reason, such as because of physical limitations, psychological shock and confusion, age and infirmity, illness, hospitalisation and injury from prior attack, do not distinguish between civilian and military targets, occur when warnings are not effective and accurate, occur with an intention to force relocation, that is, ethnic cleansing, which is itself illegal. Number 14. Palestinians love death like Israelis love life. But does this really contain the whole truth? Israel has a choice as to how many Palestinians that it kills. It often kills as many as 10 to 20 times as Hamas does in wars and conflicts. Although much of it is justified, much of it is in punishment and revenge. So does this make Israel fond of death too? Also, Israel commonly refers to military operations in Gaza as mowing the lawn or mowing the grass. Likening Palestine and its inhabitants as simple, inanimate vegetable matter suggests a fondness for killing too. Number 15. Israel inflicts the lowest civilian combatant death ratio in urban warfare history. This is fantastic achievement, and so are the millions of leaflets, phone calls and e-messages advising those in an area to leave that are subject to imminent attack. And this is contained in the humanitarian law as the precautionary principle. But the rules of war regulate each attack, not the aggregate casualty or kill ratios in a war. And this is contained in the humanitarian law rule on proportionality. There are 24 types of war crimes and 11 types of crimes against humanity in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and allegations against Israel potentially breach many of these, suggested by, for example, the record number of journalists and aid workers killed in 2024 and the highest rate of childhood amputees in the world in Gaza. Number 16. Many more Germans died in World War II than Allied troops, but this did not make them the good guys. Similarly, Palestinians are not the good guys, even though they die in much larger numbers. But there are great differences between Palestine and World War II Germany. Germany invaded, bombed and occupied at least 20 countries in a few years. It executed not only 6 million Jews, but approximately 5 million others, including Poles, Russians and Gypsies. And Israel is an occupying nation, as was Nazi Germany. Germany's occupations were defeated by force after half a decade, whereas Israeli occupations are continuing after more than 2 generations. Now, this is not to argue that Palestinians are the good guys, and certainly not Hamas, but it's just to counter this argument that is sometimes used. Number 17, the final talking point. The Allies killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in Nazi Germany, but they were not condemned for this, whereas Israel is held to a much higher standard. Although there were laws of war during World War II, the 4 Geneva Conventions were enacted in 1948, the 2 additional protocols in 1977, and the Rome Statute of the ICC in 1998, all after World War II. Also, there is no rule of war that if the Allies did it in World War II, then it is permitted in subsequent military conflict. In fact, Allied governments were not condemned for the many war crimes they committed, and individuals were seldom investigated and prosecuted. Not only have the rules of war tightened since then, there is a stricter sense of morality in the way wartime conduct is viewed, in part due to better and more intense media coverage. Before I go, here are some thoughts to consider. If Palestinians did nothing since the 1948 war aggressively, how much more land would they have now, and would they already have achieved statehood? Israel has no incentive to ever settle, given its unconditional guarantee of support by America, its occupation of approximately 95% of Palestine, and its preference for a stateless Palestine. If America paused its military funding until Israel completely withdrew from its settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, would this speed up the settlement process at all? And America's war economy and its politicians benefit greatly from this conflict dragging on forever. So why would they really try hard to end it? Thanks for watching Simon Wood's slides.